clock on the wall above the kitchen counter ticks quietly, the only sound that accompanies the soft clinking of silverware and the hum of the fridge in the background. It's 5:45 a.m. in Seattle, and the air feels damp, heavy with the remnants of last night's rain. The sunlight struggles to push its way through the gray clouds, casting a weak, filtered glow across the room. Mabel Wilson wipes her hands on the frayed edges of her apron, her movements deliberate and methodical. The diner is nearly empty at this hour, save for a few regulars hunched over their coffee mugs in the back booth, the faint smell of stale grease hanging in the air. The smell is something Mabel has grown to love over the years. It's part of the rhythm of her life, like the sound of her shoes clicking against the linoleum floor or the low murmur of the jukebox playing in the corner. This is her space, a world she built with her own hands after decades of work. But to the people who walk in and out, she's invisible. Just another worker, another face in the background. One of the men in the back booth, dressed in a crisp suit with a gold tie that glints under the overhead lights, pauses mid-sentence to glance up at her. His gaze lingers for just a moment before he quickly looks away. The kind of glance that doesn't say anything, just an acknowledgement that she exists, no more, no less. His name is Thomas Reed. He's a regular, though Mabel has never bothered to learn much about him beyond his order: eggs, sunny side up, with a side of bacon and wheat toast. She offers him a polite smile, but it's not returned. Mabel doesn't take it personally. She never has. She's learned over the years that you can't expect much from people who pass through your life in fleeting moments. They don't care who you are. They only care what you do for them. And for them, Mabel is just the woman who serves breakfast. The quiet hum of the diner is broken by the creaking of the door as a young couple walks in, talking animatedly. They're laughing, their energy filling the room in a way that makes Mabel's smile widen involuntarily. She remembers what it was like to be young and full of hope before the weight of responsibilities, losses, and disappointments slowly crept in. "Morning, Mabel," the man says as they slide into the booth by the window. It's Jason, one of the younger guys who works at the auto shop down the street. Mabel nods at him, wiping down the counter in front of them. "Morning," she replies, her voice soft but steady. "The usual?" "Yeah, and coffee, please." She turns to the coffee pot, filling 2 cups with steaming liquid, the smell rising into the air, filling the space with warmth. She sets them on their table and moves to the kitchen, where the clatter of pots and pans feels like home. The sizzle of bacon greets her ears, and she begins to assemble the orders in her mind, making sure everything is just right. But as she goes about her work, her mind drifts. There's a subtle, nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a feeling she's had for years now. It's the feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a shadow passing through other people's lives. She feels it most sharply when she's around people like Thomas Reed, who can't even spare a full glance her way. She's used to it, though. It's a cold kind of comfort. After all, the world has always treated her like she doesn't matter. For the most part, Mabel is content with her life. She's worked hard for everything she's built. Her diner, her small house in the suburbs, her simple life. She doesn't need much, never has. It's the way she was raised. But sometimes, when she's standing at this counter, looking at people who walk in and out without a second thought, she wonders if they even see her. Her hands freeze as she places the eggs on the grill. Her mind flashes to the one thing she's been trying to push out of her thoughts for months. Her father, the one man in her life who had always seen her. But even he had abandoned her, leaving her to struggle through life alone. She didn't even know he had passed until the letter arrived last week. It was from his lawyer. The letter was polite, formal, and distant. It said that her father's will had finally been read. It said that he had left her something that would change everything. She wasn't sure what to make of it yet. But for now, she focused on the sizzling sound in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of her work. She was good at this. It was the one thing that had always kept her grounded, always kept her from feeling too lost. The diner was hers, and no one could take that from her. The bell above the door jingles as another customer enters. Mabel glances up, automatically offering her usual smile. But something about this man is different. He walks in with a kind of purpose that makes Mabel pause. He's older than most of the regulars, with a graying beard and a weathered face that seems familiar somehow. He looks like the kind of person who's seen a lot of life, maybe too much. "Good morning," he says, his voice gravelly but warm. "Table for one?" Mabel nods, gesturing to the corner booth. "Right over there." She watches him sit down, but as he does, something catches her eye. There's a brief flash of recognition in his eyes as he looks at her. A fleeting moment of understanding that no one has given her in years. She doesn't know why it feels so significant, but it does. The man pulls out a newspaper and begins to scan the headlines. For a moment, Mabel considers offering him a cup of coffee, but she hesitates. It's the way he's looking at her, like he sees something beyond the surface, something hidden. She shakes off the feeling, turning back to the kitchen. She's not here for personal connections. She's here to survive, to keep things running, to keep the diner alive. And yet, as she moves toward the stove, the nagging feeling remains. It gnaws at her, the sense that something is about to change. Something big. The man's voice breaks through her thoughts. "Excuse me," he says. Mabel looks up, startled. "I couldn't help but notice. I used to come in here with a friend of mine. His name was Dave. He used to work at the factory down the road." Mabel's heart skips a beat. Dave. The name brings back a flood of memories. Her late husband, the man who had been her world before he passed away. She hasn't thought about him in years. "Dave was a good man," she replies softly. Her voice catches in her throat. "He passed away a long time ago." The man nods, his expression softening. "I know. I was just thinking about him the other day." He pauses for a moment, his eyes lingering on hers. "You've kept this place going all these years, haven't you?" Mabel nods, unsure of where this conversation is going. She's not used to people asking about her. "You've done well," the man continues, his voice carrying an odd weight. "It's rare to see someone like you, holding on when everyone else is moving on." Mabel doesn't know how to respond to that, so she just smiles politely and walks away, retreating into the safety of the kitchen. But as she stands there, staring at the stove, she can't shake the feeling that this man knows something, that he sees something in her that no one else does. It's a small thing, a fleeting moment, but something about it feels like the first crack in the wall she's built around herself. And for the first time in a long while, Mabel feels a spark of something she hasn't felt in years. Hope. The soft, rhythmic tap of Mabel's shoes echoed on the pavement as she made her way home after a long day at the diner. The sky above was still a dull gray, a reflection of the weather, but also of her mood. It had been like this for years, days spent in the background, unnoticed, with a handful of people passing through her life, none of whom ever took the time to see her for who she truly was. As she walked past the houses on her street in the modest Seattle suburb, she couldn't help but think of her own small home, a place that had seen better days. The garden was overgrown, the paint chipped, and the roof was in desperate need of repairs. But it was home. It was the place where she had raised her daughter, where she had lived with her late husband, Dave. It was the only place where she could feel a semblance of peace in her otherwise turbulent life. Mabel reached her front door and paused for a moment, her hand resting on the cool brass doorknob. She had always loved this house. It had been Dave's dream to have a place they could call their own. But now, it felt like a prison. The weight of years of struggle, of bills, of sacrifice, seemed to hang in the air, just as thick and suffocating as the humidity outside. She opened the door to an empty house, save for the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner of the living room. The silence was louder than anything else. It was the silence of years spent alone, the silence of a woman who had given everything to everyone, but never received anything in return. Mabel set her keys down on the counter and went straight to the kitchen, where she began preparing a simple dinner for herself. Spaghetti, a little sauce from a jar, and a side of garlic bread. Comfort food for a woman who had long since stopped believing she deserved anything more. As she stirred the sauce, her mind drifted back to her daughter, Rebecca. The phone call she'd received earlier had left her feeling hollow. "Mom, I need money for tuition." "It's due tomorrow," Rebecca had said, her voice distant, almost as if she were speaking to a stranger. Mabel had heard those words too many times to count, and each time they carried the same weight. A weight that said, "I need you, but only when it benefits me." She had always been the one to give money, time, advice, but every attempt to connect with her daughter was met with indifference. Rebecca had never been the child Mabel had hoped for. After hanging up, Mabel had sat in her quiet kitchen for what seemed like an eternity. She had always done everything for Rebecca, sacrificed her own comfort, her own dreams, to make sure her daughter had everything she could possibly need. Yet, no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. Tonight, just as every other night, Mabel sat at the kitchen table alone. The sound of her fork scraping against her plate was the only sound in the house. She wondered, not for the first time, if it would always be like this. If she would always be the person people turned to when they needed something, but never the one who was truly seen. But that was the nature of her life. She was the quiet, hard-working woman who never asked for anything, who never spoke up. Mabel Wilson had spent decades perfecting the art of blending in. She was the person people overlooked because she didn't demand attention. She was the woman who showed up every day, did her job and went home, but never once stood in the spotlight. Yet even now, with her head bent low in the glow of the kitchen light, she could feel a stirring inside her. A feeling she had suppressed for so long that it had almost disappeared. It was the feeling of wanting something more, something better, something for her, for once. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. It was a sound she knew too well. It was Rebecca. Mabel didn't need to look out the window to know that her daughter had arrived. She could tell by the clattering of the car door and the sound of Rebecca's footsteps on the pavement. Rebecca entered the house with barely a word of greeting as usual. Her eyes were glued to her phone as she made her way into the kitchen, and Mabel's heart sank as she watched her daughter slide into the chair across from her. "I need the money for school, Mom," Rebecca said, not looking up from her phone. "How much?" Mabel asked, her voice quieter than she intended. She could feel the weight of the years bearing down on her. 2,000. "Tuition's overdue," Rebecca replied, the words coming out like a practiced line. Mabel reached into the drawer, pulling out the checkbook she had nearly worn out over the years. She glanced at her daughter, but Rebecca wasn't looking at her. Her face was lit up by the glow of her phone, absorbed in whatever conversation or social media post had captured her attention. It was a familiar sight. Mabel sighed as she wrote out the check. She didn't have the money to spare, but this was her daughter, her only family. How could she say no? "Thanks, Mom," Rebecca said absently, taking the check from her and heading for the door without a second thought. Mabel didn't bother to follow her. She sat there, staring at the empty space where her daughter had been just moments before. A bitter smile tugged at her lips. "Thanks," she thought. That was the last thing Rebecca had said to her before she left. The coldness in her voice felt like a slap, but Mabel wouldn't show it. She never did. As the door shut behind Rebecca, Mabel took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. She hadn't realized until now how tired she was. Physically, emotionally, mentally exhausted. For so long, she had been the one to give. But no one ever noticed how much she needed. No one saw her. Her thoughts turned back to the letter she had received just days before. She had ignored it for as long as she could. Her father, who had abandoned her years ago, had left her something. Something that could change everything. But the truth was, she didn't know what to do with it. She had lived so long without asking for help, without accepting anything from anyone. But this inheritance might be the one thing that could change everything. The weight of it hung heavy in the air, but Mabel couldn't bring herself to open the letter. Not yet. Instead, she finished her meal in silence. The only sound was the tick of the clock, marking the slow passage of time. A time that seemed to have no end, no real purpose. For Mabel Wilson, this was her world. A world of silent sacrifice. But, as the evening wore on, the smallest crack appeared. Something in her stirred. Maybe, just maybe, she would stop waiting for someone else to see her. Maybe it was time to stop blending in. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Mabel's modest kitchen, casting long shadows across the worn table where she sat, staring out the window. It was a bright, sunny day in Seattle, but it felt like another gray morning in her life. The city around her was buzzing with the energy of a new day, yet she felt stuck in the same endless routine. The diner, the bills, the phone calls with Rebecca. Nothing ever changed. She had just finished cleaning the counters when the phone rang, cutting through the quiet. It was from the city, the development group who had been inquiring about her diner for the past few months. Mabel had put it off for as long as she could, but now it seemed inevitable. They wanted to meet again. She sighed and picked up the receiver. "Hello, Mabel?" A smooth voice on the other end said. It was Roger Hall, the man who'd been leading the development project. She'd never met him in person, but she had heard enough about him over the years to understand that he was one of the people who thought he could fix everything, especially when it came to real estate in Seattle. "Yes, Roger," Mabel replied, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. "We'd like to meet with you today to discuss some new developments around your property. We're moving forward with plans, and we need to finalize some details with you." Mabel could feel the weight of his words. Plans. She had heard that word too many times. Developers always had plans. They never asked the people who actually lived in the neighborhood what they thought. "I'm not sure what more there is to discuss," Mabel said quietly, trying to hold on to some sense of control. "I've told you before, I'm not interested in selling." Roger's tone shifted slightly, just enough to make Mabel feel the pressure. "Mabel, you don't understand. We're going to revitalize the whole area. This diner is a relic. It's not part of the future of this neighborhood. We need to make space for something better." His words hung in the air like a slow, choking fog. Better. It was always the same. Better meant bigger, newer, more expensive. It didn't mean the people who had lived here for decades. It didn't mean the people who had fought to make this community what it was. "I'm not selling," Mabel said again, more firmly this time, "and I won't change my mind." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I understand, Mabel, but just know that you're going to miss out on something big. We'll be in touch." The line clicked as he hung up. Mabel stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to her ear, staring out the window at the street she had known for most of her life. The street where she had opened her diner, where she had spent endless hours cooking, cleaning, and serving meals to people who rarely looked up from their phones or their conversations to acknowledge her. The same street that was about to be transformed by people who didn't even know her name. She set the phone down slowly and took a deep breath, but it did nothing to calm the storm swirling inside her. Her diner was more than just a business. It was the legacy of her late husband, Dave. It was the place where they had laughed, fought, and dreamed together. It was where she had poured everything into building a life. And now, it seemed like all of that was worth nothing to people like Roger Hall. Mabel glanced at the calendar on the wall. It was the beginning of September, and the air had begun to take on the crispness of autumn. She had always loved the fall, even though it felt like a time of change, a season that whispered of endings and new beginnings. But today, it didn't feel like a season of hope. It felt like the beginning of something inevitable. She walked into the living room, her steps slow, as if she was already carrying a burden too heavy for her shoulders. The house was eerily silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Mabel sat on the couch, her hands resting on her lap, staring at nothing in particular. She had always prided herself on being strong. She had raised her daughter alone, kept the diner running for over 20 years, and managed to keep her life from falling apart when Dave died. But this felt different. This wasn't just about her diner. It wasn't just about the years of hard work she had put in. It was about her dignity. She reached for the envelope that had been sitting unopened on the coffee table for the past few days. The letter from the lawyer, the one she had been trying not to think about. She knew what it contained, and yet, the idea of reading it made her stomach twist. Her hands shook as she tore open the envelope, pulling out the legal document inside. It was a simple letter from her father's lawyer, informing her that her father had passed away and that she had been named as the sole heir to his estate. The estate wasn't enormous, but it was substantial. Far more than Mabel had ever imagined her father leaving her. The letter outlined the details of the inheritance, along with the instructions for claiming it. Mabel's head spun as she read, the words blurring together. Her father, the man who had left her when she was just a child, had left her more than just money. He had left her power. But what did it really mean? Could she accept this inheritance, knowing how little her father had cared for her? How many years had she spent feeling like she was unworthy of anything? Of emotions rose inside her. Anger, resentment, pain. It had always been like this, her life a series of small disappointments and missed opportunities. She had given so much of herself, but no one ever saw her, except for the ones who wanted something from her. Her thoughts turned back to Rebecca. The phone call earlier still stung. Her daughter had been cold, distant, demanding money like it was an expectation. Mabel had always been the one to give, to sacrifice, to try and make up for the things she couldn't fix. But now it felt like everything she had done, everything she had given, was for nothing. Her hands tightened into fists as the frustration boiled over. She had spent so long being the person everyone leaned on, the woman who always showed up, the woman who always gave. But now, when it was time for her to stand up for herself, to fight for what was hers, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Mabel closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the pressure of years spent being overlooked, the weight of her own self-doubt. But deep down, something else was stirring, a flicker of defiance, a desire for change. Maybe it's time to stop being invisible, she thought. Maybe it's time to stop giving without receiving. Mabel's hand found its way to her coat pocket, where her cell phone rested. She pulled it out and stared at it for a moment. The numbers in her contacts list didn't seem as daunting as they once had. For years, she had hidden behind her diner, behind her routine, behind the quiet life she had built. But now, she felt a fire inside her, an urge to reclaim what was hers. She couldn't do it alone. She couldn't do it without help. But she was done waiting for permission. The man, Roger Hall, had made it clear that her time was running out. But what if it wasn't? What if Mabel could change the game? What if she could show them all that she wasn't just the woman who served them breakfast? That she was the woman who had built this town, who had fought for every inch of her space, who had quietly given everything she had to keep things running. It was time to stop being invisible. The morning that Mabel Wilson had been dreading finally arrived. It was a Tuesday, still early, and the world outside her window was cloaked in mist, the city of Seattle hidden under a blanket of fog. Mabel stood in front of the mirror, her reflection a mixture of strength and uncertainty. She had always been the type to wear her weariness like a second skin, but today, something was different. Today, she was no longer just the diner lady. Today, she was someone else. Mabel had been staring at the letter from her father's lawyer for the last 2 days. She had read it over and over, trying to wrap her mind around what it meant. Her father, the man who had walked out on her when she was a child, had left her more than just money. He had left her control over her life, over the diner, and over a neighborhood that had always felt like it belonged to everyone except her. The weight of the inheritance was overwhelming. The estate wasn't massive, but it was enough to change everything. Enough to make her see the world differently. Her father had built something that could elevate Mabel beyond the humble existence she had known. But Mabel didn't know if she could take it. How could she accept something from a man who had abandoned her? But then, a deeper realization settled in, quiet but undeniable. She had spent her life giving to others, never asking for anything in return. And now she had the chance to take something for herself. Mabel placed the letter down on the table and pulled on her coat. She had made a decision. She was going to meet with Roger Hall. She was going to look him in the eye and show him that the diner, and everything it stood for, was not something that could be discarded. Mabel's footsteps were slow and deliberate as she walked to the car. The small Toyota Corolla she had driven for years hummed softly as she started it up, the engine rattling like a tired old man who had seen better days. But the car had been good to her. Like everything else in her life, it had done its job, never once asking for more than she could give. As she drove, her mind replayed the events of the past week. She had heard the whispers from her regulars, the ones who came in every morning, talking about the new developments coming to the area. The developers had promised a new life for the neighborhood, but Mabel could see through it all. This wasn't about improvement. It was about money. It was about erasing people like her. People who had built their lives from the ground up, who had worked tirelessly just to survive. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. By the time Mabel reached the sleek, glass and steel building downtown where the meeting was to take place, her nerves were taut. She parked her car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, the streets now bustling with the midday crowd. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, their faces a blur as they rushed past her. But Mabel kept her pace steady. She was no longer afraid to stand her ground. The building loomed ahead of her, its towering form casting a long shadow on the street. She entered through the revolving doors, stepping into a polished lobby that smelled faintly of fresh-cut flowers and expensive cologne. Mabel felt out of place here, surrounded by the modern trappings of wealth and success. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the reception desk. "I'm here for a meeting with Roger Hall," she said, her voice firm. The receptionist, a young woman in a perfectly pressed suit, looked up at Mabel, her eyes briefly flicking over her before she nodded. "Right this way," she said, leading Mabel to the elevator. Mabel's heart beat a little faster as the elevator doors closed behind her. She wasn't used to spaces like this. She wasn't used to being the one with the power. She was used to being the one in the background, always observing, never participating. But today she was different. Today she had something that the others didn't, a voice, and she was going to use it. When the elevator doors opened, Mabel stepped into a sleek, modern office, complete with glass walls and dark wood furniture. Roger Hall was standing by the window, looking out over the city. He turned as Mabel entered, his sharp suit contrasting with the softness of her worn dress. "Mabel," he said, his voice smooth but distant, as if he were speaking to someone beneath his notice. "I'm glad you could make it. Please have a seat." Mabel nodded and sat down across from him, her eyes never leaving his. She wasn't going to let him control this conversation. She wasn't going to let him treat her like she was invisible, like she didn't matter. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks now, Mabel," Roger began, his tone condescending but polite. "We have big plans for this neighborhood, and we think your property could be part of that future." Mabel crossed her arms and leaned forward slightly. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice steady. "You've asked me about this before, and I've told you before. I'm not interested in your plans. This diner, this neighborhood, it's mine. It's been mine for over 20 years. Roger's smile didn't falter, but there was something in his eyes that Mabel didn't like. "Mabel, you're not seeing the bigger picture. This is about progress. The area is changing. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago. You're holding on to the past. We're trying to move forward." Mabel's gaze sharpened. "You call it progress. I call it erasure." Her voice had a bite now, a quiet fury that made Roger pause. "You don't understand what this place means to people like me. You think you can just come in, throw money at something, and make it better. But you're wrong. This place isn't just a business. It's part of the community. And I'm not going to let you take it away from me." Roger's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her, as if trying to figure out what made her tick. "I see," he said, his tone changing slightly. "So, you're going to fight for it? You think you can keep it all together? All on your own?" Mabel leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't need anyone's help to keep what's mine, but I will fight for it. I've spent my whole life fighting, and I'm not about to stop now." Roger's face softened, though it was still hard to tell if he was impressed or just intrigued. "Well, Mabel, it seems you've made your decision, but understand this is bigger than you. This is bigger than your diner. It's about the future of this city." Mabel shook her head, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. The future doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone who's built this place with their blood, sweat, and tears. And if you think I'm going to let you bulldoze over it, you've got another thing coming." For the first time, Roger seemed at a loss for words. There was a long silence between them, thick with tension. But Mabel wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "I've lived my whole life being overlooked, being told I don't matter. But I'm not that woman anymore. I don't need to ask for permission. I've fought for everything I have, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else take it from me." Roger sat back, his expression unreadable, but Mabel could see the shift in him. For the first time in their conversation, he wasn't the one in control. And that, Mabel thought, was the beginning of something new. Mabel's footsteps echoed through the quiet diner as she closed up for the night. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, its flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. Most of the regulars had left long ago, their morning routines finished, but Mabel remained, cleaning the counters and making sure everything was just right. This place was more than a job to her. It was her anchor, her purpose. But as the days passed, she found herself standing on the edge of something new, something unfamiliar. The meeting with Roger had shifted something deep within her. For the first time in a long time, Mabel felt seen. Her words had made an impact. She wasn't invisible anymore, but the battle was far from over. Roger had made it clear that he wasn't going to back down easily. He would continue to push, continue to try to persuade her to sell. But Mabel wasn't going to be swayed. She had worked too hard, given too much, to let someone else decide the fate of her diner. This was her legacy. It was more than just bricks and mortar. It was where she had spent countless hours, where she had laughed, cried, and built her life after Dave had passed. This was the one place where she had a voice, and she wasn't going to lose it. As Mabel wiped down the last of the tables, her mind wandered back to the letter from her father's lawyer. She had put it out of her mind after their conversation, but the weight of the inheritance was always there, hanging over her like a cloud. She had never asked for her father's wealth, never sought his approval. But now, as she stood alone in the diner, it was clear that this was her chance to take control of her life in a way she never had before. She wasn't going to let Roger or anyone else dictate her future. She had already spent too much of her life being pushed aside. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. But the question still lingered. What exactly did she do with this newfound power? She had the money, the resources, and the chance to rebuild. But what did it mean if she didn't know what to do with it? Could she really change her life? Could she rebuild her place in the world? Or was it just a fleeting opportunity that would slip through her fingers like everything else? The next morning, Mabel didn't open the diner. Instead, she drove to the office of a lawyer she had found online, someone who specialized in small businesses and real estate. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she needed answers. She needed someone who could help her make sense of the inheritance, someone who could guide her through the steps she needed to take to protect her diner. The office was small and modest, tucked away on a side street in downtown Seattle. It wasn't the kind of place where billion-dollar deals were made, but it felt real, grounded. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named Frank Simmons, greeted her with a firm handshake and led her into his office. "What can I do for you, Ms. Wilson?" he asked, sitting down across from her at his desk. Mabel glanced around the office, her nerves making her feel a little out of place. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with legal tomes and business guides, and there was a framed certificate on the wall, indicating Frank's qualifications. I need help," Mabel said, her voice steady but unsure. "I've inherited something from my father, and I don't know what to do with it. I don't even know if I should take it." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "It's money, land, and, well, it's complicated. I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing." Frank leaned forward, listening intently. "Let's take it one step at a time," he said, pulling out a notepad and a pen. "Tell me everything you know." Mabel spent the next hour detailing the inheritance, the estate, the land, and the mixed feelings she had about accepting it. Frank listened patiently, nodding along as she spoke. When she finished, he set his pen down and looked at her thoughtfully. "Well, Mabel," he said slowly, It sounds like you've been handed an opportunity. Whether you want to take it is up to you, of course. But I think the first step is clear. You need to secure your assets and make sure no one else can take them from you. That includes your diner. If you don't act now, someone else will. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known it was coming. Roger Hall and the other developers weren't going to give up easily. But hearing it from Frank made it real. It was no longer just about keeping her diner alive. It was about standing her ground, claiming what was hers, and not allowing anyone to erase her from the picture. "I'll help you," Frank continued, his voice steady. "We'll go over the legal steps, the paperwork, everything. You don't have to do this alone." Mabel nodded, her heart beating faster now. She had never been one to ask for help, but for the first time in years she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. That afternoon, Mabel returned to the diner and locked the doors behind her. The familiar sounds of the kitchen greeted her like an old friend, the clinking of utensils and the hum of the fridge providing a sense of calm. But she knew things had changed. She couldn't just go on as she had before. If she wanted to keep this place, if she wanted to keep her life, she was going to have to fight for it. Mabel's phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from Rebecca. "Mom, I need the money by the end of the week. Please, it's urgent." Mabel stared at the message for a moment, her fingers tightening around the phone. The urgency in Rebecca's words was nothing new. It was always urgent when Rebecca needed something. But when it was Mabel who needed help, it was always too late. She took a deep breath, placing the phone down on the counter. This time, things were different. She wasn't going to give in. Not this time. As she stood there, staring at the phone, something inside her shifted. She wasn't going to keep giving, not when it meant giving everything away. She was going to stand her ground, and this time she was going to demand the respect she had always deserved. The diner wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. The weeks following her meeting with Roger Hall were a blur of activity, each day moving at a pace that felt too fast to keep up with. Mabel spent her mornings at the diner, serving breakfast to the same tired faces, but her mind was elsewhere. In the afternoons, she sat with Frank Simmons, her lawyer, reviewing paperwork, signing documents, and making the necessary arrangements to ensure that the inheritance would be properly secured. The process was slow, but with each step, Mabel felt a little more empowered, a little less like the woman who had been overlooked for most of her life. But the real turning point came one Friday morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. Mabel was in the kitchen, cracking eggs for a batch of scrambled eggs, when the door opened with its usual jingle. She looked up, expecting to see a regular customer. Maybe Thomas Reed, the man who came in every morning for his eggs and toast. But instead, a man she didn't recognize stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a suit that looked too expensive for a small-town diner. His dark eyes were sharp, and his face was set in a way that made him seem important. Mabel took a moment to study him before she offered her usual polite greeting. "Morning," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked over to the counter. "What can I get you today?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll have a coffee, black please, and a seat by the window." Mabel nodded, pouring the coffee and placing it in front of him. She didn't know why, but something about this man rubbed her the wrong way. He didn't have the friendly demeanor of the regulars, the ones who knew her name and acknowledged her existence with a nod. He wasn't the kind of person who looked at her and saw her for what she was. He saw her as a cog in a machine, nothing more. As she turned to go back to the kitchen, he spoke again, his voice low and measured. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge. Mabel paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Should I?" The man chuckled softly, as if her answer amused him. "I'm Roger Hall's right-hand man. We've been in talks about your diner." Mabel felt her stomach tighten. Roger Hall's name still made her blood boil. She had hoped that after their last meeting, he would have backed off. But she was quickly learning that nothing in her life was ever that easy. She turned slowly, facing him with a calm that she didn't entirely feel. "I know who Roger Hall is," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not interested in selling. I've told him that already." The man leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "Mabel, you don't understand," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "This neighborhood is changing whether you want it to or not. And if you don't want to be left behind, you'll have to make a decision. You can either sell to us now, or we'll have to make it more difficult for you." Mabel's heart skipped a beat. The veiled threat in his words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment, she considered walking away, letting it slide. But that wasn't who she was anymore. She wasn't the woman who walked away. She wasn't the woman who gave in without a fight. With a steady breath, she walked up to the counter, her eyes locking with his. "I don't care what you or Roger think," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. You can't just come in here and take what's mine. This diner isn't just a business to me. It's my life. You think I'll back down just because you're sitting here in your fancy suit? You're wrong." For the first time since he had walked in, the man's expression shifted. His smile faltered, and a flicker of annoyance crossed H. "You don't understand, do you?" the man said, his voice low now, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "We could bulldoze this entire area and build a shopping center. Your diner would be nothing but rubble. You think anyone will care? You're just one small business in a city that's moving forward. Get with the times, Mabel." Mabel shook her head, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "You may have the money, the power, and the connections, but you'll never have what I have. You'll never have the people who have been coming in here for years. You'll never understand what it means to build something from nothing. You'll never understand what it means to fight for something that matters." The man stood in front of her for a moment longer, his jaw clenched tightly, before he stepped back. He eyed her one last time, his expression a mix of disbelief and contempt. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold now. "But we'll see how long your stubbornness lasts." He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing as he walked toward the door. Mabel watched him go, her hands clenched tightly by her sides. She felt the weight of his words linger, like a shadow hanging over her. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid. The door jingled as it shut behind him, and Mabel stood there for a moment, taking slow, deliberate breaths. She could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins, the strength that had been building inside her since that first letter arrived. It wasn't just the inheritance she had to fight for. It was everything. Her dignity, her pride, her place in the world. Later that afternoon, Mabel met with Frank Simmons again, this time to go over the next steps in securing her inheritance. She was no longer just the woman behind the counter at the diner. She was the woman who owned the land, who had a legacy to protect. As Frank went over the legalities with her, Mabel's mind kept returning to the encounter with Roger's associate. She had expected him to try and intimidate her, to rattle her, but she hadn't flinched. She had stood firm, and in doing so, something inside her had shifted. "I've made my decision, Frank," she said, her voice strong. "I'm not selling. This is mine. I've worked too hard for this, and I won't let them take it." Frank nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good. That's what I like to hear. You've got the legal ground to stand on, Mabel. Now it's time to take the next step. You're in control now." And for the first time in a long time, Mabel felt it. She was in control. She had fought for her place in the world, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away from her. The rain had been pouring relentlessly for days, and as Mabel stood at the counter of her diner, she couldn't help but appreciate the comfort of the familiar. The sound of the rain tapping on the windows was soothing, a constant reminder that she had built something that still stood, still mattered, despite the world around her changing, despite everything that had been thrown at her. The door jingled, and Mabel looked up, expecting another dreary morning customer. But the man who walked in wasn't a regular. He was tall, dressed sharply in a navy suit that seemed almost out of place in a small-town diner. His shoes clicked against the floor, and his presence filled the room in a way that made Mabel pause. He wasn't just some businessman looking for a cup of coffee. No, this was different. She could feel it. He slid into the booth by the window without waiting for her to greet him. A confident, almost arrogant move. The kind of move that told Mabel he was used to getting what he wanted. He pulled out a phone and began typing something, oblivious to her presence. She watched him for a moment, the ever-present curiosity creeping into her thoughts. Who was this man? Her instincts told her that this wasn't a chance encounter. This was the continuation of something she had already felt, the pressure that had been mounting ever since her meeting with Roger Hall. Mabel had fought to keep her diner, to stand her ground. She had hoped that her refusal to sell would be the end of it. But clearly it wasn't. She wiped her hands on her apron, steeling herself for whatever this man wanted. "Can I get you something to drink?" Mabel asked, her voice steady but with an edge she hadn't used before. He looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning her for a moment. There was something calculating about the way he observed her, as though he was trying to decide what kind of threat she might pose. "A coffee. Black," he said, his tone clipped, dismissive even. Mabel nodded and moved to pour his coffee, her movements deliberate. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. Not anymore. Not after everything she had already faced. She set the cup in front of him without a word, but he didn't immediately drink. Instead, he placed his phone down on the table and met her gaze. His posture was relaxed, but Mabel could sense that this wasn't a casual visit. Something was off. "I've been following your situation for a while, Mabel," he said, his voice smooth, confident. "The diner, the neighborhood, the inheritance. I know what you're trying to do, but you're wasting your time." Mabel's pulse quickened. She had heard these words before in a different context, but it still stung. The insinuation that she was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The same words Roger had used when he spoke of revitalizing the neighborhood, of erasing the things that didn't fit into his vision of the future. She didn't respond immediately, instead opting to take a step back, leaning against the counter. "And who are you exactly?" she asked, her tone colder now, sharpening with every word. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm Greg Larson," he said, his voice almost patronizing. "I work with Roger Hall. He's asked me to handle this personally." At the mention of Roger's name, something shifted inside Mabel. She felt the familiar wave of anger rise in her chest, but this time it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like fuel. "You're the one he sent to try and push me out of my own life?" Mabel asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Do you really think that's going to work?" Greg chuckled softly, as if her question were some kind of joke. "Mabel, let's not pretend you have a choice here. This neighborhood is going through a transformation, whether you like it or not. You're standing in the way of something bigger. You're one person, one small business, and in the grand scheme of things, you don't matter." Those words, "you don't matter," hit Mabel like a slap across the face. It was the same phrase she had heard her whole life, but it wasn't just about her diner anymore. It was about her as a person. She felt the anger build inside her, but it wasn't the kind of anger that would make her lash out or make a rash decision. No, this was different. This was the kind of anger that came with clarity. The kind of anger that made her realize how long she had been underestimated, how many times she had been overlooked. "You think I don't matter?" she asked, her voice low, steady. "Let me tell you something, Greg. I spent my entire life being told I don't matter. From the day my father left me to the moment my husband died. I've had people look at me and think I don't belong. I've had people treat me like a nobody, like I'm invisible. But you're wrong. I do matter, and I'll make sure you never forget that." Greg blinked, taken aback by the shift in her tone. For a brief moment, Mabel saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even respect. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He wasn't used to people like her standing up for themselves. He wasn't used to seeing women like Mabel hold their ground. "You're wasting your time," Greg repeated, this time with a hint of frustration in his voice. "You don't have the power to stop what's coming." Mabel leaned forward, her hands steady on the counter. Maybe I don't have the power to stop you, but I do have the power to make you see me, to make you understand that I'm not just some obstacle for you to clear. I'm not just some woman you can push around. Greg sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He was silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. I told Roger that you were stubborn, he said, finally breaking the silence. But I didn't think you'd be this much trouble. Mabel didn't flinch at his words. She simply smiled, a small, almost sad smile. Well, Greg, she said, I've been in trouble before, and I've always come out on top. Greg's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. We'll see about that. With that, he stood up and walked out of the diner, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The door jingled as he left, and the silence that followed felt like the calm before a storm. Mabel stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected the encounter to go like this. She hadn't expected to feel so powerful, so in control. But she did. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was no longer the woman who just took what came her way. She was the woman who was taking charge of her own fate. As she watched Greg walk away, a sense of clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about her. About proving to herself that she could stand up to anyone, no matter how much money or power they had. The world might have thought she was a nobody, but Mabel Wilson knew better. And now, so did Greg Larson. The storm had passed. The clouds had finally parted, and the streets of Seattle shimmered with the soft light of early evening. Mabel walked slowly down the familiar sidewalk, the soles of her shoes clicking softly on the wet pavement, a rhythm she had grown accustomed to over the years. But today felt different. Today, the weight of the world seemed just a little lighter. Mabel had spent the past several days reeling from the encounter with Greg Larson. The man's words had stung, but they had also ignited something deep within her. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked woman who had let others dictate her life. The realization came slowly, like the dawn breaking over the horizon, but it had come all the same. She was more than the diner, more than the small business owner who had always been pushed aside. She had a name, she had a voice, and for the first time she was going to use it. Her father's inheritance weighed heavily on her thoughts, but she had come to see it as a gift. Not just the wealth or the property, but the power it represented, the power to take control of her own life. For years, she had been invisible to those around her, just another face in the crowd. But now she had the chance to redefine herself. She could shape her future, choose her path, and leave behind the life of quiet survival she had grown so accustomed to. As she walked towards her diner, Mabel felt a sense of pride building in her chest. It was her diner, her community, her life, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away from her. Not Roger Hall, not Greg Larson, and certainly not the gentrifying forces that had come to this neighborhood, trying to sweep her out like dust under a rug. Mabel reached the diner and paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sight of the building. It wasn't much to look at, but it was hers. The faded neon sign buzzed softly in the twilight, and through the windows, she could see the familiar tables and booths, the chipped counter, and the black and white checkered floors she had scrubbed clean 1,000 times. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling, and immediately, the warmth of the diner embraced her. The scent of coffee, eggs, and bacon lingered in the air, a comforting reminder of the many years she had spent here. The sounds of silverware clinking against plates and the soft hum of the jukebox playing in the background were like an old melody that never grew old. Mabel took a deep breath, letting the peace of the space settle into her bones. The diner had always been more than just a place of work. It had been her sanctuary, her refuge from the world outside. And now she realized it could be her weapon, her stand, her legacy. As she walked behind the counter, her hands moved instinctively, wiping down the surfaces and setting the tables. But her mind was elsewhere. It was on the future, on the legacy she would leave behind. She no longer saw herself as just the woman who worked at the diner. She was the woman who would decide its fate. The door jingled again, and Mabel looked up to see a familiar face. It was Elaine, the woman who had come in every Tuesday for the past few years. Mabel greeted her with a smile, and Elaine slid into the booth by the window. "Morning, Mabel," Elaine said warmly. "How's your day going?" Mabel paused for a moment, considering the question. A week ago, she would have answered with the usual, same old, but now there was something more to it. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was living, really living. "It's good," Mabel replied, her voice steady, confident. "It's better than it's been in a long time." Elaine raised an eyebrow, noticing the change in Mabel's demeanor. "Well, that's good to hear. You seem different. Lighter, maybe?" Mabel smiled, setting a cup of coffee in front of Elaine. "I think I've finally figured some things out." Elaine took a sip of the coffee, her eyes never leaving Mabel. "You know, you've always been so strong. I've always admired that about you. But I get the feeling that something's shifting for you. You're not just holding on anymore. You're stepping into something new." Mabel felt a warmth spread through her chest at Elaine's words. It wasn't just the coffee. It was the recognition, the understanding. For the first time in a long time, someone else saw the change in her. "I'm stepping into my future, Elaine," Mabel said quietly. "I'm not going to let anyone tell me what I'm worth anymore. Not even my own daughter." Elaine's eyes softened, her expression one of understanding. "You've always been there for people, Mabel. It's time for people to see you." Mabel nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep into her heart. She had always been the one to give her time, her energy, her money. But no one had ever asked her what she needed. No one had ever seen her for who she truly was. But now that was changing. As the day stretched on, Mabel found herself lost in thought. She was no longer the woman who just worked in a diner. She wasn't the woman who had spent her life being invisible. She was the woman who would leave a legacy. The woman who would stand tall, regardless of what anyone else thought. That night, after closing the diner, Mabel sat down with the letter from her father once more. It still felt strange, knowing that he had left her something. But as she reread the terms of the inheritance, she felt the weight of it in a way she hadn't before. She wasn't just inheriting property. She was inheriting power. The next morning, she woke up early and walked to the back of the diner. The sun had barely risen, casting the world in a soft pink light. Mabel stood in the parking lot behind the diner, her eyes scanning the street. The neighborhood was changing, sure, but she wasn't going to let it change her. She wasn't going to let it erase the people and the history that had shaped this place. She pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping the screen. "Frank," she typed, "I'm ready. Let's move forward with securing the land. And this time, let's make sure I'm not just a bystander in my own life." The air was cool with the first hint of fall, and the quiet hum of the diner filled Mabel's ears as she stood behind the counter, wiping down the last of the tables. The neighborhood had changed, there was no doubt about it. But it wasn't just the gentrification that had crept through like a thief in the night. It was something deeper, something personal. Mabel had changed, and it felt right. In the weeks since her meeting with Greg Larson and the subsequent shift in her mindset, Mabel had taken deliberate steps to take control of her future. She had worked with Frank Simmons, her lawyer, to ensure her inheritance was fully secured. She had made the decision to keep the diner, to fight for it, to make sure that it wasn't just a relic of the past. The world had told her that she didn't matter for so long, and now, she was proving them wrong. Roger Hall and his team, including Larson, had underestimated her. They thought she was just a small-town business owner, one who could be easily bought or pushed aside. But they hadn't accounted for her resilience, her unwillingness to back down. And now, as Mabel looked out over the diner, she realized that the real victory wasn't in the money or the inheritance. It was in the reclamation of her own life. It had taken years, but she was finally stepping into the person she was always meant to be. The door to the diner jingled, and Mabel turned to see the familiar face of Elaine, the woman who had become one of her closest friends. Elaine had been there through the hard times, offering kind words and encouragement when Mabel felt like she couldn't keep going. Today, she had something new for Mabel. "I saw something today," Mabel Elaine said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I think it's time you saw it, too. Mabel raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? Come on, Elaine said, waving her hand in the air, signaling for Mabel to follow. I think you'll like it. Mabel hesitated for a moment but followed Elaine outside. The crisp air greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The familiar sight of the diner, the people coming and going, the rhythm of it all. It felt like home, but she had always known that home could change, that she could change. Elaine led her a few blocks down the street to a spot Mabel had passed countless times but never really noticed. It was a newer building, sleek and modern, but it didn't quite fit with the older charm of the neighborhood. A large sign hung above the door, and Mabel squinted to read it. Wilson's Corner Bistro. It took Mabel a moment to process what she was seeing. The name was hers. The bistro was hers. It was the first thing that Mabel had done for herself in years. Mabel stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape. What is this? She whispered. This, Elaine said with a grin, is your future. It's your place. I've been talking to some folks, and they're ready to back you. You've worked too hard for too long, Mabel. It's time to start something new. Mabel felt her heart race, the emotions crashing over her like a wave. She had never asked for anything like this. She had never expected something so monumental to come out of her small, everyday life. But here it was, the opportunity to not just survive but thrive. To create something that would leave a mark, that would honor her past and build a future. How? Mabel's voice faltered as she tried to find the words. Elaine smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. I've been talking to some people, working with your lawyer. We've got the backing, Mabel. You've earned it. You've earned your name. Mabel's mind raced, her heart fluttering in her chest. The sign outside wasn't just a name, it was her identity. It was the recognition she had fought for, the respect she had longed for. The diner, the legacy of her husband, was still hers. But this new venture, this new chapter, felt something beyond the struggle. She felt pride. It was a feeling that had been buried deep within her for so long, hidden under years of sacrifice, of giving and giving without receiving anything in return. This was the moment Mabel had been waiting for. The moment where everything that had come before her, the years of hard work, the struggles, the sacrifices, came to fruition. She wasn't just someone who ran a diner anymore. She was someone who was shaping her own destiny. She was someone who had found her voice. This is just the beginning, Mabel, Elaine said, her voice full of warmth. You've got everything you need. It's your time now. Mabel nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had always been the one to make things happen for everyone else. But now, she was making it happen for herself. The quiet woman who had been overlooked for so long was finally stepping into her power. Later that afternoon, Mabel stood in her diner, her hands resting on the counter as she gazed around the familiar space. The decision to start the bistro had felt like a leap, but as she looked out over the diner, she knew she wasn't leaving anything behind. She was building on it, honoring it. The future was not about erasing the past, it was about adding to it. She had finally understood that. The sound of the door opening broke her reverie, and Mabel turned to see one of her regulars walk in. Thomas Reed, the man who had come in every morning for years. He sat down at his usual spot at the counter and looked up at Mabel with a smile. I hear you're opening something new, he said, his voice filled with curiosity. A bistro, huh? Mabel smiled, the weight of everything she had been carrying lifting just a little more. That's right, she said, her voice steady. It's time. Thomas raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting between Mabel and the space around her. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've been coming here for years, Mabel. I never really paid much attention, but I see it now. You've got something special here. Always have. Mabel nodded, a small, contented smile playing on her lips. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Really seen. Thank you, Thomas, she said quietly. That means more than you know. As the days passed and the plans for the bistro began to take shape, Mabel found herself in the midst of a quiet revolution. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of transformation that made headlines. But it was hers. It was real. And as she stood at the counter of the diner, watching the sun set over the city, she finally understood something important. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Her name was Mabel Wilson, and they would know it. The night had fallen over the city, but the diner was still alive, humming with the soft sounds of quiet conversation and the comforting clink of dishes. Mabel stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a slow, rhythmic motion. It had become a routine, one she had followed for years, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't just the movement of her hands. It was the change that had quietly woven itself into the fabric of her life. The diner was no longer just a place to serve food. It was a symbol, a testament to the years of hard work, the sacrifices, and the quiet strength that had brought her here. And though Mabel had been running this place for decades, she was beginning to see it in a new light. Tonight, there was no looming threat of developers trying to push her out. Roger Hall's team had made their last attempt to convince her, but she had stood her ground. Mabel had refused to sell, and in doing so, she had reclaimed something vital. Not just her business, but her dignity, her voice, her place in this world. The soft bell over the door jingled as a familiar face entered the diner. It was Thomas Reed, one of her regulars, but tonight he wasn't just passing through. He was here for a reason, and Mabel could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just a customer anymore. He was someone who had witnessed her struggle, and now he was witnessing her triumph. "Evening, Mabel," Thomas said as he slid into his usual seat by the window. "Evening, Thomas," Mabel replied, smiling as she made her way over to him. "What can I get you tonight?" Thomas studied her for a moment, his eyes soft but filled with something more than casual friendliness. "I hear you're doing well," he said, his tone steady. "I hear you're opening that bistro. That's something." Mabel nodded, but this time, there was no hesitation. "Yes, I am. It's time to move forward." Thomas leaned back in his seat, his gaze never leaving her. "You know, Mabel, I've been coming here for years, and I've seen a lot of things in this town change. But you're something different. You don't give up. Never have." Mabel's hand paused over the counter, the familiar movements of cleaning suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the weight of Thomas's words. "You don't give up." It was a simple phrase, but it was one Mabel had never heard directed at her in such a clear, undeniable way. And for the first time, she felt it. She felt it in the way her chest swelled with pride, in the way her heart beat a little faster. "I've had my moments," Mabel replied, her voice low but steady. "But I'm still here. I'm still standing." Thomas smiled, a knowing, warm smile. "You're more than just standing, Mabel. You're building something bigger than all of us." Mabel looked out the window, watching the rain begin to fall again, soft and steady against the glass. The world outside was changing, but she had learned to stop fearing it. The bistro, the diner, the inheritance. These were pieces of a puzzle she was finally putting together. A puzzle that wasn't just about survival, but about thriving, about creating something that would outlast her, something that would carry her legacy forward. The next morning, Mabel stood at the window of her apartment, looking out at the street below. The neighborhood was waking up, the sounds of people going about their daily routines filling the air. The world had moved around her for so long, but now, she was part of the movement. She was shaping it. The phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Frank Simmons. It was a simple message, but it carried weight. "The papers are finalized. You're good to go, Mabel. Let's make this official." Mabel felt a small smile tug at her lips as she typed back a quick response. "Thank you. It's time." Later that day, Mabel walked into the newly renovated space that would soon be her bistro. The smell of fresh paint, new wood, and the faint scent of sawdust filled the air. The workers were finishing up the final touches, and Mabel couldn't help but marvel at how far she had come. The space wasn't just beautiful. It was hers. Every corner, every detail had been chosen by her, with care and attention. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was a reflection of her journey, her growth. The sign above the door now read, Wilson's Corner Bistro, the name she had chosen. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration. It was her stake in this community, her claim on her future. She was no longer just the woman behind the counter at the diner. She was Mabel Wilson, a woman who had fought for her place in the world, and now she was taking it. Mabel stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. The rain had stopped, and the light of the afternoon sun poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over the space. This wasn't just a new business. It was a new chapter, a chapter she had written herself. As she stood there, the door opened, and Elaine walked in. Mabel's friend, her confidant, the one who had always believed in her when no one else did. "You did it," Elaine said, her voice filled with awe as she looked around the bistro. "It's beautiful." Mabel nodded, a deep sense of pride filling her chest. "It's ours, Elaine. This is just the beginning." Elaine smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I've always known you could do it. You're not just a survivor, Mabel. You're a force. And now the world's going to see it." Mabel stood tall, her gaze steady and filled with determination. She wasn't the same woman who had stood behind the counter at the diner, serving meals with a quiet smile. She had changed. She had found her voice, her strength, and now she was stepping into her future. She was finally the woman she was always meant to be. And as she looked around at the space she had created, she realized something. It wasn't just the bistro or the diner. It was everything. The people, the struggles, the sacrifices. They had all brought her to this moment. And now nothing could take it away. Mabel Wilson had fought for her place in the world. And now the world would know her name.